Hello, I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I am the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm in a room full of journalists, and I could hardly be happier. I'm particularly delighted to welcome you all to the first Daimler Foreign Policy Forum of the spring semester. Tonight's talk is Making Headway, Exploring the World's Challenges and the Role of Journalism Through the Lens of Progress, which will be delivered by Michael Kimlin of the New York Times. Michael is no stranger to Berlin or the American Academy, and he is one of the most versatile journalists of his generation. I'm incredibly pleased that he has come to discuss his ambitious efforts to innovate in new directions in journalism here. It is not my place to make his introduction, so I will leave it there. But I did want to say that Michael is the rare Academy guest of whom it could be said that even before he takes the podium, his visit has been successful. I say that because at the Academy we seek to use our slightly hackneyed phrases to build bridges, revitalize ties, and bring people together. And Michael told me today over lunch that we had already achieved that just last night when he was reunited with last night's speaker, Christopher Gibbs, with whom he actually went to high school some years ago. They had not seen each other in the interim. So this would be a great heartwarming story in the daily press. Now, we did not at the Academy set out to revitalize ties among New Yorkers. It's true. But I think that we will take our successes where we can get them, and I am declaring this an achievement. Tonight, Michael will be formally introduced by the Berlin-based American architect Frank Barkow, who will occupy this podium shortly, and it's appropriate because among his many professional roles, Michael Kimlin is the architecture critic of the New York Times. This all seems appropriate. Frank is half of the noted German-American architecture firm Barkow Leibinger, which he co-founded with Regina Leibinger, a longtime trustee of the American Academy in Berlin. Born in the United States and I believe in the great state of Montana, Frank has taught at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, the Royal College of Art in London, Cornell University, and other great institutions. He, too, is a longtime friend of the Academy, and he is someone who has made a significant impact on our institution. Barkow Leibinger turned what was a rundown bathhouse and gym in our backyard into a beautiful, lightweight glass and steel structure, which you can't see from this room, but you can have a look at afterward, or you can look at online, that we call the Fellows Pavilion. And it's where our fellows have their private offices with a not too shabby view on the Wannsee. Among Barkow Leibinger's other projects are, am I correct, Tour Total? Is that it? The German headquarters of the French Oil Company, which is right near Berlin's Hauptbahnhof, the Serpentine Summer House in London, and many others. I just learned about one in Cambridge, or Allston, I should say, Massachusetts. So there are lots of buildings out there. And another one is the Sid Richardson Residential College at Rice University in Houston. The firm's projects have been exhibited internationally and nationally at the Biennale in Venice, the Pinakothek in Munich, MoMA in New York, and shortly after I got here, at a terrific exhibition right here in Berlin at the Waldhaus? Haus am Wald? Yeah. All right, wherever it was terrific. I loved it. Anyway, they have been decorated in all kinds of different ways with lots of different prizes, too numerous to list. All I can say is I'm delighted to have Frank and his great expertise here tonight, and I look forward to hearing more from Michael and from the audience. Frank, thank you for agreeing to do that, and it's over to you.
Gosh, thank you, Daniel. I wish I was doing the talk tonight. That was an amazing introduction. I meant to say a few things. That Michael Kimlin is the first distinguished visitor this semester at the American Academy. His lectureship, The Foreign Policy Forum, is made possible through the specific support of the Daimler Fonds im Stifterverband für die Deutsche Wissenschaft. And some of the former lecturers as part of this Foreign Policy Forum at the American Academy have included Ambassador Bill Burns, historian John Connolly, and policy expert Lynn Vavreck, among others over the years. So my introduction, Michael, I mean, we've known each other, I think, for 10 years or so from the time that you guys were here in Berlin. So, but I was going to say that at a time when journalism has never been more relevant or urgent, we're going to hear from a journalist tonight who will be talking about progress as a topic in of itself that needs close scrutiny and in light of current events. Be that of a war in Ukraine or topics such as climate change, rising waters and their impact on cities, immigration, or issues imperative also for us here in Berlin, such as affordable housing, facing a second and current refugee crisis, and how these people are housed or integrated. That the importance of truth endures and how one can change based on knowledge, and specifically, how do you construct knowledge? To ask the question, what is progress? How do we measure it? How do we make it? Michael Kimlin is the architecture critic, as was said at the New York Times 2011, and founder at large of Headway, a nonprofit initiative at the Times focused on exploring some of these global issues and the biggest challenges through the lens of progress. His work has focused on issues such as public housing, public space, infrastructure, urbanism, environmentalism, and community development. In other words, architecture is an inclusive discipline, and Michael has been able to talk about it and within its cultural, historical, social, and physical context. When Michael left Berlin some 10 years ago, when he was the foreign correspondent for his column abroad here, he asked me, and I'm sure you asked others at the time, what should I write about? Which took me a little back, this kind of openness, this curiosity, but surely this was essentially, this is essential for good criticism, finding things out. We spent an afternoon driving around in Berlin looking at architecture, talking about projects from the eve of the international building exhibitions, historical architecture, the latest urban developments, as we were tonight, about New York and places like Hudson Yards. What was good, what was bad, what were our opportunities missed in a layered involving Berlin, that architecture is a living thing you could experience and consider. We talked about Ludwig Kirchplatz and why we thought this was a fantastic public space, what made it good, why. I mean, this idea of, I think, what lessons in a way could be learned from such a place. And this is an approach that Michael has called pilgrimage, or something he has extended to New York with his walking tours with distinguished architects like David A.J. or one of my favorite urban cultural observers, Luc Sant, that architecture and urbanism is something you look at with your own two eyes and consider, talk about, think about. It's not so much about expertise as observation, consideration. And this was an early lesson my partner, Regina, and I learned as students at Harvard, where we learned from key critics like Robin Evans how to look at architecture, think about architecture. So this is also at a time when an architecture critic for an American newspaper is an ever rarer commodity, which makes me think about journalism as an instrument for change, and an instrument for criticism, and ultimately an instrument for progress. Born and raised in New York City, Michael received degrees from Yale and Harvard, was the Times' longtime chief art critic. He was, or sometimes, adjunct professor at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture Planning and Preservation, and is the author of the best-selling book, An Accidental Masterpiece, and contributes regularly to the New York Review of Books. An Accidental Masterpiece, a collection of essays about art, is a testimony to the idea of pilgrimage, of looking at things yourself, and in direct experience of things situated in the context they were conceived in and meant to be experienced in. With this in mind, and how we will think about the future, please welcome Michael Kimlin back to the American Academy. a quick note before I go over the Mac. If you have questions, I think the talk is around 50 minutes. If you have questions, raise your hand like this. If you're on Zoom, don't do that. Submit your questions in the Zoom platform and send them here, and they will be submitted. So it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Frank. And I remember asking you that question. And yeah, I did ask a few other people, too. It's always a good thing to do. So, really, I'm very grateful and touched by that. And thank you, Dan. And I want to take the opportunity to thank the incredible staff at the Academy. It's really an honor and pleasure to spend a few days here and meet and talk with this wonderful, generous, really friendly bunch of fellows. And to reconnect with some old friends, a few of whom are here from the days when I lived here. I miss Berlin very much, but I'm a New Yorker, so I feel, incredibly guilty about being in such a luxurious place at a time, of such trauma and uncertainty with the war almost next door. Lviv, I now have learned, is closer to Berlin than Paris. And not to mention in the middle of a pandemic, which was all we could talk about a few weeks ago. Now our attention has been diverted again, and it's hard to think about anything else except Ukraine. What I want to talk about is partly how some of us doing journalism affect the conversation, how we do and might focus attention, and even help build communities around challenges and issues that can get crowded from the front page, or that we may ignore at our peril to go down some toxic rabbit hole on social media, looking, I think, increasingly to affirm our despair and creeping sense of nihilism. What would be a constructive conversation? What would that look like? And how can we, at an organization like mine, the New York Times, do what we do best, meaning serious, skeptical, investigative, enterprise journalism in a way that doesn't only lean into disaster, and calamity. It's a question I started asking myself in recent years, and it comes up as a matter of course in my work as an architecture critic, because I'm going to try to show you how can we build better buildings, neighborhoods, and cities? What might it mean to frame the challenges we face in designing a better world, and what are the obstacles to progress? When I talk about fostering constructive conversation as journalists, I'm not talking about a good news section of the Times or about what is sometimes called solutions journalism. I think solutions is a word that sets you up for criticism and failure. I hadn't actually heard of solutions journalism when I cooked up the idea for Headway, which I should say is a philanthropically supported 3-year project at the Times, free and accessible to everyone, meaning outside the paywall. And we launched just 3 months ago, so it's very much a work in progress. I also want to say the terms with our nonprofit supporters guarantee that they have zero control over what we do, zero input into our stories, no knowledge even of what we are publishing. And I think of us as a kind of laboratory for ideas that are still admittedly nebulous, which we hope to seed and spread if they work, and maybe use to help resuscitate local journalism, which in America is dying, along with our public understanding of democracy. I hope you'll forgive what is probably going to be a somewhat self-centered discursive talk. It's intended to spark a conversation at the end, and that's what Headway is intended to do too. It was an idea, as I said, that was percolating for years, and I persuaded my bosses to take a chance on it. The Times has become a much more nimble and innovative organization over the years I've worked there. But the main idea I had, the one really good idea I had, was to put together a team of journalists who, unlike me, actually know what they're doing and know how to do a startup and a new enterprise. So our chief editor is a man named Matt Thompson. I will do my best to give you some sense of our ambitions and Matt's ideas. I'd like to begin by asking you to consider a few questions the Headway team asked Times readers when we launched in December. And I'll give you the answers later, but I'll just put them in your head. So here's the first. In 2010, the Consumer Goods Forum pledged to help end deforestation by 2020 on behalf of its roughly 400 corporate members. And some companies like Nestle and Carrefour vowed to eliminate deforestation from their supply chains. How many of these companies do you think succeeded? That's the first question. Second, what progress do you expect we made in reducing extreme poverty? In 1990, 36% of the world's population lived on less than $1.25 a day. UN members, nations, pledged in 2000 to cut that percentage in half. What do you think actually happened? Third, in 2009, the European Union pledged that its emissions in 2020 would be 20% lower than they were in 1990. Did the Union meet that goal? And lastly, in 1990, about 25% of the world's population did not have drinking water from an improved water source like a pipe or well. In 2000, the UN pledged that by 2015, it would cut that proportion by half. Did it succeed? Okay, with that in mind, this is a picture by my friend, and Frank's too, and probably Nicholas's too, Iwan Baan, a wonderful Dutch photographer, of New York City right after Lower Manhattan's lights were turned off by Superstorm Sandy. In 2012, not many months after I'd returned from Berlin, actually, Sandy reclaimed the coastline of Lower Manhattan for Mother Nature. It made landfall around Atlantic City, swept north, ravaged the New Jersey coast, destroyed thousands of homes, inundated New York City with waves as high as 14 feet, and shuttered Wall Street. And for a moment, it inundated all the landfill that New Yorkers, going back to the Dutch settlers, had added to the island, retracing the island's original 17th century contours. The storm caused tens of billions of dollars in damage all across the region and killed more than 100 people. It was clearly a sign of things to come with extreme weather and climate change, and it begged for a federal response. So President Obama turned to a man named Sean Donovan, his Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, who came up with a novel idea for a federal competition called Rebuild by Design. International teams of architects and engineers were invited to conceive flood protection proposals in collaboration with members of the affected communities. Several dozen proposals surfaced, and in 2014, 7 winners were selected. The projects that moved forward were going to share the $1 billion in federal grants that were part of the program. And by far the largest grant, more than $300 million, went to a resiliency project that focused on reimagining the coastline of Lower Manhattan called the Big U. And that's what you see here. The first part of the Big U, by the way, the architects for that were Big, Bjarke Ingels and his group, and One Architecture, another Dutch firm. And the first part of the Big U was to be undertaken to reconfigure a stretch of the East River in Manhattan where some of the worst damage had been done to an aging complex of public housing projects, which are home to more than 100,000 people. And they line a highway called the FDR Drive. The drive borders a riverfront park devised in the 1930s by the city's planning czar. So those are basically the projects all the way up along here. And this is the highway, as you see, and this is the park right along the river. This is the proposal to redo the park, but this gives you a better sense of just the sort of topography and geography. And the park is called East River Park. So borrowing ideas from the Dutch, the Big U plan imagined a redesigned East River Park, as you see here, that could withstand flooding from future Sandy level events by constructing what was basically a grassy reinforced hill or berm on the western edge of the highway of the FDR Drive, which would be built to act as a barrier, holding back the floodwaters and protecting the housing on the other side. The plan went through years of public workshops, town halls, open houses, attended by thousands of community members. They approved. Its estimated price tag rose to about $760 million. I became fascinated by the plan because the political stars somehow seemed to be aligning at that point. You know, federal, state, city governments, as well as neighborhood groups all pulling in unison to tackle climate change on a meaningful scale in ways that prioritized design and the needs and desires of vulnerable populations. rebuild, in spirit at least, seemed to me to hark back to the creative sort of can-do days of the New Deal. And I visited various sites with Secretary Donovan and sat in on rebuild meetings and invited the plan's architects to graduate classes I taught at Columbia on climate change and global cities. And then everything blew up. At the 11th hour, City Hall changed the plan, the price tag more than doubled, and East River Park became a symbol and microcosm of our divided society and the pitfalls of deliberative democracy. Instead of a berm, the whole park would be demolished and reconstructed 10 feet higher on landfill at a cost of something like 1.6 billion US over 4 years. We'll see if they manage to stick with that price. The plan promised protection from future Sandy level storm events for a few decades, which was progress of a sort. The poor, largely black and Hispanic public housing residents were skeptical, but then bought into the plan because they wanted protection and they were the ones who had been hurt and the most vulnerable. But a group of mostly white and wealthier Lower East Siders started to raise hell. And suddenly, a process that was supposed to build community had divided the community along racial and economic lines. What did this say about our processes and goals? Is our society just too afraid to come together around basic material needs? This was the story we decided to tell when we introduced Headway in December, a story about how to think about progress. But its roots go back, for me, to the first story I did when I moved back from Berlin. So when I got back there, the memorial at Ground Zero was opening, and there were various projects that were nearing completion that I was sort of expected to do. But just as Frank said, I started asking around, like, what should I write about? Mm-hmm. And I was really curious about the state of affordable housing. It wasn't really as much talked about as the issue during the Bloomberg years there, but it kept coming up, and I kept wondering what was being done about it. And it seemed like a crisis that architecture needed to address. So I started looking around the South Bronx, where there were a lot of projects, and found one that everyone seemed to be interested in, and it was called Verde. It was by Grimshaw and Datner, two architectural firms, and the developers were Jonathan Rose and a nonprofit developer called Phipps Houses, a venerable nonprofit. And the project was really interesting. It involved a lengthy process of consultation with residents of the neighborhood. What did they need? Well, a lot of what they needed was better health. There were a lot of asthma and diabetes in the neighborhood. And so what people wanted was a healthy place. And the architects thought about that a lot. They also wanted the potential for home ownership. So the project became a very complex model of what you call Section 8 rental housing, subsidized rental housing vouchers, and co-ops for first-time co-op owners, subsidized as well. There was a health clinic. The design of the building was done to encourage walking over using elevators. And it had a large community garden. And of course, it put a premium on architecture. It basically said that spending more for better architecture was worth it. So it raised a certain question that housing advocates were raising in particular, and that is, could such money that goes for better buildings go to build more apartments? What is the value of good architecture in terms of dignity or community pride and investment, beauty? Why do we need it? And how do we measure success in a building like this? By the way, this is a rendering, but it ended up looking pretty much like this. And right in front here is the community garden, which I started to attend. I used to go to community garden meetings in the beginning. It was really cool. And they grew just like amazing stuff very quickly with the help of a group called NY Grow. So that was one project, and when I published that, I was really interested in the reaction because clearly there was an appetite for a conversation around some of these issues that saw architecture as part of a larger conversation around the city we were building, equity, the value of architecture in terms measurable to people who were not necessarily in the field, and so on. And another thing I did was to, in asking around, to ask about Pennsylvania Station. Penn Station, as I'm guessing many of you know, is is an incredible hellhole. And a terrible mistake. It's sort of the most notorious, Vincent Scully's phrase, rat's maze, and in New York, especially compared to Grand Central, which is one of the great portals to a city, symbolic and profound, and it's in the way it connects as well to the streets around it. Penn Station, you sort of scurry down these pathetic steps into a impossible, kind of disgusting nether region, and it replaced this, which is a hard act to follow. Though I will tell you that the interesting thing about this great McKim-Mead-White building from 1910 is that by the 1960s, or really by the late 50s, when this conversation about replacing Penn Station started, people like to forget this now, but it was a shabby place. It was owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad. It was losing a fortune because rail travel was being replaced by car travel. And so it was a kind of white elephant, and there was a sense that it was an insupportable building. There was not a conversation about historic preservation at that time. It sparked that conversation, really created the movement in a meaningful way. There was a lot of agreement about the need for urban renewal, and Penn Station, which, by the way, had replaced an African-American community called the Tenderloin, and the displacement of the Tenderloin is one thing that spurred the growth of Harlem, just as a little side note. But the feeling was that Penn Station had outlived its usefulness, and that what was needed was something like a new arena and a new skyscraper office tower, and only a few people would be taking the train, so just put them downstairs underground. So that didn't seem like a good idea some years later, because they had predicted that 200,000 people would use Pennsylvania Station, and now it is the busiest transportation hub in the Western Hemisphere. A population much, much larger than the population of Boston uses it every single day, or did before COVID, and actually the predictions are a larger number will use it afterwards. So it's not designed for that, it's not safe or whatever. And the conversation when I got back to New York around it had kind of stopped. People had sort of given up. So I just thought, well, that's something to write about. So I started to write about Penn Station a bunch of times. And then I enlisted an architect named Vishaan Chakrabarty, who runs a firm called Powell in New York, and to get his firm to think about what Penn Station might look like if it were to be redesigned. So Vishaan did a series of renderings. Oops, sorry, going the wrong way. Essentially what he decided to do is you're looking at the person from the same spot. He essentially gutted the shell of the drum-like arena, clad it in glass, and gave people some idea of an alternative. We can talk about whether this is possible or not possible or whatever, but he also showed the outside of the arena. This is one of the grimmest places, and showed you what would happen if it could be opened up. It was a provocation. I thought this was a good idea. It wasn't my attempt to suggest what was the solution, but to surface one idea, one possible approach, and therefore to give people something to to picture and to debate, because it could be hard to imagine what is possible when you only know what you have. And this indeed has been one strategy, I think, which I've used and which is important to open up a conversation, an ongoing conversation over time. And, the conversation about Penn Station is ongoing. This building, the post office building next door, also designed by McKim, Mead & White, as a companion to the original Penn Station, has now been partly gutted and reopened as a new train hall for part of the or Amtrak, it's called, for part of Penn Station. It's not a solution to the problems in Penn Station, but the money and the politics behind that came from the fact that people started to talk about Penn Station. I'm not taking credit for this. I'm simply saying that the one role that I have, a small but I think useful role that media has, is to help to support a conversation that needs to take place more broadly. And it's taking place now around what to do with Penn. And the issues are, I think, correct. They're around issues of public space, equity, and the future. I'm going through just a list of things I've done. I know that's not a beautiful picture, but at that time I was thinking, okay, well, if we're trying to measure, think about what architecture can do and what my role is, there was a lot of talk, there is, in the medical profession about what role design plays in healthcare in particular, and specifically, can good design or some kind of design help to heal the sick? I found the University Medical Center in Princeton, which had outgrown its old home and so needed a new one, and the management there decided to build a model patient room, a mock patient room. And they first surveyed staff and patients, and then the nurses and doctors spent months with Post-it notes and sort of designing this model room in the old hospital, and they moved in equipment, and then they moved in patients, so they can compare the reactions and health of patients in the old rooms and the model room, the new room. The patients with the same conditions, mostly hip and knee replacements. So what were the results? The patients in the model room said the food and the nursing care was much better than the patients in the old room said. The meals and the nurses were exactly the same. But the real eye-opener, which was meaningful, was the patients also asked for 30% less pain medication. So reduced pain, of course, has this cascade effect, right? It hastens recovery and rehabilitation, leads to shorter stays, diminishes not just costs, but also the chances for accidents and infections. So when the new, $500 million, I think, hospital opened on a new campus, this is what people got. I thought that was interesting. And then I'm leaping around. You're just going to have to stick with me, sorry. The war started in Syria, as you all know here, and I went to a refugee camp called Zaatari. I don't know, Nicholas, you ever went there, but Zaatari in Jordan, just across the border. And the reason I went is because it had been originally the worst place in the world. It was very notorious in the beginning. There was an enormous amount of violence. Those early months were just a mess. And then I started to hear that it was the most remarkable place anybody at the UNHCR had ever seen. Because what had basically happened is that the people who arrived and were given a tent and a liter of water took over the camp. And they essentially built themselves, nope, they didn't do that. I keep pressing the wrong, sorry. They built themselves a kind of model city. They organized themselves into neighborhoods. They built commercial streets. They opened businesses. And when I got there, I couldn't believe it. All of this is completely against the rules. None of this, including just basically having electricity, is allowed. But the man who ran it, a rather remarkable man, a German named Kimlin Kleinschmidt, sort of forged an alliance with a lot of what were essentially criminals running this place, but criminals who were building a city. And for instance, the UNHCR would give people a tent and tell them where to go, but people wanted to be with their families or with their friends. They wanted to create neighborhoods. They wanted gardens. They had businesses. Many of these people had been middle-class Syrians in the south of Syria. They'd been used to living in a house with 2 cars. They weren't used to living in a tent. They used to run a business, so they opened the businesses here. There were people running this camp who had to go to the people running the pizza place to ask people where they lived because the pizza place had a delivery service. There were travel agencies. You weren't even supposed to have anybody come in and out of the camp. Travel agencies were serving all sorts of people. There were bridal shops. It was fantastic. And I thought it was one of the most remarkable profound examples, short-lived, but still, about the nature of informality. You know, we talk about slums and favelas around the world, and sometimes urbanists and others talk about learning from them. But how much do we really know about them? I mean, some 2 billion people are going to live informally by mid-century, according to some estimates. That's a third of the world's population or more, Will. What is the world that is being built? We barely know all the forms it takes. We don't even know, most of us, what the word informality means. We haven't mapped much of the world. Can we give people in these places, can we begin to map this stuff? Can we have some people in these places help us, tell us how they live and what? I mean, some cases we do know, but I mean, how they form communities and spaces. Help us map them, to give them a louder voice in a global conversation about the future and the form it should take. They're shaping our future. This was a little family I met. I just wanted to put in the picture. They had just moved in. So this was, you know, what you got on day 2 or something was a tent for a family of 8. And one more example, because it led, of course, directly to Headway. I was during this time noticing that, you know, climate change was really not getting the traction it deserved because, surveys told us, people felt it was just not something tangible, not something immediate that was affecting their lives. But climate change is an opportunistic threat. It is with us now and everywhere. And it identifies and capitalizes on our weaknesses, social, political, infrastructural, economic. That flood during Sandy, restoring the original shape of the island, essentially outlining our hubris, was a good example. So I undertook a series for the paper's foreign desk, which actually kicked off our climate coverage, about cities and the way climate change threatens their precarious conditions. And I started with Mexico City, which drained all of its lakes when the Spanish arrived and is now sinking fast, as you may know. And then I went to other places, the Pearl River Delta and Houston. I went to Jakarta here, which is sinking faster than any other big city on the planet, faster than climate change is causing the sea to rise. So surreally fast that rivers sometimes flow upstream and ordinary rains just swamp neighborhoods. And buildings are actually literally disappearing, swallowed up into the earth. You know, you have a lot of corrupt government and corporate growth in what was in peatlands, strip mining them and then polluting the rivers that flow into Jakarta. So Jakarta's digging a lot of illegal wells and drip by drip essentially, draining the aquifers underneath the ground, which is causing the city that rests on top to sink. So now about 40% of Jakarta lies below sea level. And coastal districts like this one have sunk by as much as 14 feet in the last decade or so. I mean, more than the height of this room. So now the Indonesian government is simply thinking of moving the capitals to someplace else completely. It's the sort of story a writer really can get into. It's apocalyptic, it's huge, makes great pictures. But I noticed that the story in this series that really struck a chord with many readers was the one I actually initially didn't want to do, about Rotterdam and the Dutch, because it was the one story that turned climate, a crisis, into an opportunity. Writing about the Dutch seemed to me sort of a cliche and too obvious and a little complicated by Dutch reliance on oil and just their own self-promotion as water experts. But they have done some remarkable things. And, Rotterdam is one of the world's busiest ports. Most of it is below sea level. And the Dutch, among other things, built this incredible piece of infrastructure called the Maaskering, which is basically 2 Eiffel Towers that can close and protect the canal, it's not a river, from a storm, what is called a once in every 10,000 year storm. In the United States, we fuss about 1 in 10 year storms. They're preparing for something that's going to happen in, I don't know when a new species has occurred. But they did that, but they also have built, for instance, a dike that doubles as a mile-long park in an underserved neighborhood of the city, and they turned water retention ponds into parks and squares that were intended to help revive, kind of forlorn areas of the city. The point is they saw a threat as a chance to reimagine the future in more equitable, economically sensible ways. Not perfect at it, but readers were clearly hungry for more than just another really bad news story. They wanted the bad news, but they also wanted to know what could be done. They wanted a discussion that was broader than the one that they were getting. So out of all of this grew the idea for Headway. And when I took it to, I pursued it, and then at some point our editor, Dean Baquet, asked to talk to me. And he said, is this just like some other opinion section you're bringing to the news section? He was concerned about this. For all of you journalists out there, you'll understand this perfectly. And my answer is, well, what is the climate section? It's a section that reflects our conviction that climate change is real. It's something we need to deal with. It's not good. In the same way we deal with issues around poverty and racial justice. We do take sides already, but the question is how we do it. And our ostensible brief at Headway is around the built world, or the world we're building. They're kind of the same thing, but they also describe a material condition and the future. So we're not, I'm sorry, I have my finger here resting on the little thing, so forgive me for causing you headaches. I want to stress this, that at the moment anyway, Headway's, we have a lot of stuff about public policy or about the effect of sanctions on the ruble, or what happened to the pound as a result of Brexit, or how to fix the Supreme Court of the United States. This I don't think we needed more of, but I do think we could build discussions around some of the things I was suggesting. Land use and equity, housing, water, climate, the built world, literally the world we are building. So how can we help people think about the future, imagine different scenarios? Headway's been working with futurists, something I never thought I would do, but really interesting, on potential exercises, public games. We want this to be interesting and fun for people. It's, of course, not entirely outside a newspaper's purview, because speculating about the future is what election coverage does. It's what sports writers explaining the odds on football games do. It's what climate reporters do, more or less, as a given in every story. But it is not typically how we as journalists describe our mission. And to begin to talk about possible futures, we also need to think more longitudinally in time, not just about now, in this minute, in the latest crisis. And so to understand the future, we need to learn from experience to know how the past perceived or misperceived the future. So we kicked off Headway in December with the series, with my story on East River, and with the series I mentioned at the start. It was called Hindsight, which raised those questions I asked. Okay, so deforestation, the companies, the foreign companies, how many of them managed to, they're vowing to eliminate deforestation in their supply chains? Any guess about how many of them succeeded? Yes. What?
All of them.
All of them succeeded? Thank you, Lawrence. None of them succeeded. But good. You were gaming where you thought I was going, but that's why I put that one first. Okay, in 1990, 36% of the world's population lived on less than $1.25 a day, and the UN pledged to cut that number in half. What happened? Yes, it exceeded the goal. By 2015, the percentage has fallen to 12%. Okay, the European Union pledged that its emissions would be 20% lower than they were in 1990. Succeeded. They surpassed that goal, notching emissions that were 24% lower than in 1990 by 2020. But a large part of the success is reducing emissions. It turns on a kind of accounting, which I'm not going to get into here. Still, point taken. In 1990, about 25% of the world's population did not have drinking water from an improved water source, like pipe. 2000, UN pledged to cut that proportion in half. Did they succeed? You're saying no? Glad there's consensus. The goal was met 3 years before the deadline. But there was a problem, because while more people had access to water through new pipes, not all of the water was in fact fit to drink. So now the U.S. can test for contamination in water and says that 74% of the world has access to what it now calls safely managed drinking water. I'll remind you that's up from 25%. Okay, so we surveyed people, and when we launched Headway, we started asking them a whole series of questions I'll get to, and then Matt followed up with a letter we published called Dear People of 2022, in which he asked readers to make their own predictions for this year. In the letter, I want to quote Matt, because he recalled Hans Rosling, who became, as you may know, a kind of statistical evangelist for the idea of progress. And as Matt wrote, debates over whether he was a Pollyanna-ish optimist stalked him even to his death when the posthumous publication of his book Factfulness drew him and his critics back into public discourse. The tussle over Dr. Rosling's worldview is one small reflection of a broad popular ambivalence about the notion of progress. At this moment, this particular moment in the life of our species, as the planet steadily gets hotter and more polluted, extreme weather events wreak havoc on our lives, a lethal pandemic ripples in waves around the world, conflicts explode over land and water rights, a resurgence of authoritarianism stalks established democracies, and many of our fellow species confront the threat of mass extinction. That lens is, to put it mildly, suspect. The people of 2021 were not, it turns out, great at hindsight. Most got one correct answer out of a possible 5. Many of the responses we received, this is all still Matt, had a Hans Rosling-like effect. Their sentiment from a respondent, in Houston struck a common chord, quote, progress has left many behind and the work will always be incomplete. But looking at past predictions where we are today, I have hope for our future, naively or not. And as I said, hindsight was accompanied by my long story on East River Park, whose ups and downs became that scaffolding for a broader discussion about our shifting attitudes towards expertise and the shifting nature of participatory government. These are wonderful photographs, by the way. We really have tried to do great by photography. And I'll just say, you know, some of the responses we got. So I'll get to how we're dealing with respondents, but I just wanted to put this up here. We were asking a variety of things to introduce the project. And then our reporter Ruth McLean in West Africa and Caleb Kabanda did a truly remarkable story from Congo for us about peatland, which I'm sure, as you all know, absorb twice as much carbon as all of the forests of the world, and so are, in many ways, the most critical component, about which we know, obviously, precious little, but is often land that developers want to mine, and locals see as a source as a result of income. So how do we resolve these conflicts in ways that do not harm the people who have nothing and did nothing to cause climate change? And again, these remarkable photographs, this case by Nana Heitman. I think I forgot to mention Daniel Arnold was the remarkable photographer who did my stuff. And we also did a whole visual package that sort of explained peat and started to ask people questions about it. But the main thing that I think is Headway's experimental aspect, because in some ways those stories are conventional long-form journalism, though I'd like to think they twist the lens a little bit in asking an upfront question. But I think the main hope for us doing something new involves what I call the public square. It's a work in progress, but I've thought obviously a lot in this job about public squares and the relationship to democracy. And, not long after I went back to New York, the Occupy movement happened. And it wasn't insignificant that Occupy manifested itself by essentially taking over a public space and turning it into a little town, a little polis, a little ideal version of what these people were arguing for. That may sound a little exaggerated, but there was quite a conscious attempt, both in places like New York and Istanbul and elsewhere, to organize the space that was occupied into a kind of town with areas, libraries, eating areas, lots of different sort of components that make up a city. I don't think that was incidental. I think there is a relationship between the way we think of democracy and society and the way we think of public space. Think of the Arab Spring. I mean, for all the sort of early nonsense about this is the triumph of social media, it turned out not to be, but the really most effective parts of it had to do a lot with the occupation of Tahrir Square. There weren't that many people in Tahrir Square, and there were even fewer in Zuccotti Park in New York for Occupy, but the effect was far greater than what was happening online. So the public square, I think, is a meaningful thing. And at the heart of Headway is this desire to use this thing that we have, this global platform of the times, to make it free and accessible, as a kind of gathering place for experts and really everyone else who's engaged by the issues we're talking about. We want to measure success not only in terms of page views, but in terms of community engagement. We want people to share their stories, to ask questions, and for our experts to help us shape responses. So for Pete, we created what we call the Bog Squad. The Times, like other media organizations, is very good at projecting outwards, about putting something out there and then having this thing, like a comment section, which is a kind of performative version of interaction, but doesn't really go anywhere. Headway really does, our goal really is to try to invite people in. So the Bog Squad is an advisory group, experts and concerned citizens, as I said, whom Terry, our public square editor, started to put together, more than 100 people, long before we ran the piece. They live and breathe this issue, but there are millions who don't, so our goal is to connect some of these experts with some of those who've written, and to begin this conversation, and out of that, to cultivate stories and to follow these stories over time. So we're going to do the same with the story I'm working on now on homelessness. We're putting together a home team. This is a little bit of the Bog Squad, and it just shows you Terry's lists and who some of these people are and what they say and what they think we should be saying. Some of it's just basic journalism, like some of it's due diligence, right? You call people who know more than you do, and you check stuff with them, and you see what they think is going to be interesting and useful. But it's almost always a one-off enterprise. I mean, you build relationships, but not always around a series of topics or a process of doing this, and allowing those people essentially a space on your platform to share and hopefully to begin to have conversations of their own. So this is just a little thing Terry prepared, before publication. There's a lot of planning, talking about who's doing what, talking to the deciders, seeding some questions in public before the publication, and then following up afterwards as well. Sorry, I was going to say engagement, obviously this part of the talk where I'm talking to other journalists, but it's a lot of work, right? And it raises this interesting question, especially for an organization like ours. I mean, what is the benefit of investing all this energy in cultivating maybe 1,000 people around a subject? But I think this is one crucial way in which our nonprofit status, we're not a nonprofit, but our engagement with nonprofit, which gives us a certain life in this beyond the payroll, I think that helps us think somewhat in terms of different metrics. And so we want to measure our success in the way we move conversations forward and connect communities who are often siloed. I will say about that Penn Station, one of the things I really noticed, and it affected me a lot in Headway, is that there were a lot of people who'd been talking about Penn Station, were concerned, but they didn't talk to each other. They didn't even like each other. There were people in the architecture world who thought that, the arena and the underground was just disgusting, but there were people in the transportation world who really weren't concerned about that. They were concerned about the tracks and about capacity and about other things, and they thought the conversation around the architecture was a distraction and a kind of vanity. And then there were other issues as well. The point is, we all had shared interests here, but we weren't talking to each other. And one thing I felt very acutely was that the Times itself was common ground. It was the public square. So how could we expand on that idea and do something else with it? And that's sort of the experiment that we're hoping to do here. Sorry, I duplicated some slides. So as I said, the latest, I'm ending here, will be my thing on homelessness. So I started to do this research. I'll just say, I went to Houston. Houston has reduced homelessness by 60%, and it's eliminated veteran homelessness, and it's on the verge of doing the same for what's called chronic homelessness. And I don't know about you, but when I heard that, I thought, well, how did they do it? So I went there in July and saw the clearing of an encampment under a highway. Everyone in the camp was moved that day into a real apartment. One of them was this woman, Terry, who'd been living on the street for 5 years. She was separated from her baby daughter when someone saw the two of them fishing for food at a pond near their tent and threatened to call child services. So I followed Terry from the encampment. This is my picture of her getting the keys, or at least a copy of the keys, to her new apartment when she moved. And she was really excited about moving because she wanted to retrieve her daughter from her sister's place. Homelessness is an American version of the larger condition of informality I mentioned earlier. I think it's also a Rorschach, Headway Rorschach, because like those questions I asked at the beginning, we see it exploding in places we pay attention to, the West Coast and New York. I think many people think it's intractable. Experts will tell you it is not. Nationally, in America, by the way, homelessness has decreased by 10.3% during the last decade. And Houston is an interesting case. So I'll publish that soon, but I'll just show you. I went to visit Terry for Headway a few weeks ago, and she settled in. That's her there. This is her case managers. That's her apartment. That's Blessed is her daughter's name is Blessed, and she's living with Blessed, who was sleeping in the bedroom. So I was introduced, but quietly. So that's it. I'll take questions. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Obviously, there's more to the story about homelessness than simply just turning over nice apartments to them. Can you just elaborate a little bit more about the success of this project?
About what Houston's doing?
The project, yeah.
Houston basically has not reinvented the wheel. They're just doing what has been prescribed for a while, but cities can't do, which is interesting. It has a couple of basic parts. One is what's called housing first. So housing first means that you move people directly from the streets into apartments, not shelters. The shelter system in New York is a multi-billion-dollar insanity. That's basically a way of getting people off streets because we don't have enough housing. Housing first means you move people in without preconditions. So they don't have to be sober, they don't have to... My analogy would be, if someone's drowning in the ocean, the lifeguard doesn't go out there and say, you're going to have to learn to swim first before I bring you back. You bring them back to shore, you give them a condition in which they can begin to address their problems, and then they do or they don't with the help of caseworkers. But either way, they're housed, so they're no longer homeless. I mean, I bet some of us have neighbors and friends who might have mental illness issues or drink or something, but they do it behind closed doors. So you don't look at them the same as you do someone on the street who has mental illness or is alcoholic, and you relate that to their condition of homelessness. So their being housed immediately changes the terms in which they exist. And the other thing they've done, which is crucial, is they've created what's called a consortium of care. Essentially what that means is that all the organizations, public and private, that are engaged in this issue, so service providers, charities, churches, and so on, come together around the consortium under a head organization. In Houston, it's the Coalition for the Homeless. Share their data and cooperate. So first of all, they collect data and then share it, and then cooperate according to what's called a vulnerability index. Everybody who's in Houston who's homeless is found, assessed is the word, and given a vulnerability index number. I don't mean to get too much into the weeds, but think of it this way. In most cities, you enter into the system when you're homeless at some point. You go somewhere, maybe they have something for you, they hand you a meal or a bed for the night, or maybe they'll direct you someplace else. You're navigating this vast, incomprehensible forest at the most vulnerable point in your life. It's impossible. And the organizations don't generally talk to each other, often because they compete for funds and because they have their own priorities. So maybe one of them says, you have to be sober to get to get help from us or whatever. The consortium means you obey by the same rules, you share the data, and when someone is assessed and enters the system, then the system directs them to the services and shepherds them through that system. So it flips the idea. So in this case, at this encampment, outreach workers went to the encampment. Other cities do this, they just don't do it well. Went to the encampment, found out who was there, found out their conditions, found apartments for them first, and placed them all in those apartments immediately. Now, there's so many caveats with homelessness, right? Homelessness is people living on a street. Homelessness is not housing insecurity. It isn't the thousands and thousands of kids and parents who couch surf or undergrads who live in their car or something. It's homeless people who are homeless. So that's one crucial caveat. And then not everyone is housed permanently with their rent paid forever. So Terry and Blessed are on a ticking clock, and they have a few months for Terry, who's been traumatized her entire life, no drugs or any addictions of any kind, to sort of recover from her trauma, find a job, find schooling and care for Blessed, and find a way to pay this rent. And the clock is ticking. She's got a few months left. It's not perfect, but it sure is better than living, in a pond and fishing for your food. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Of course.
For tonight's speech, and congratulations to a remarkable project. I wonder why you took the grants of philanthropic institutions. I mean, The Times is a very profitable and successful paper. Dean Baquet is a smart editor-in-chief. So why are you not just part of the main operation of the New York Times? Did you deliberately want it to be separated, or was there just not the will or the money to fund such a great project?
Yeah, it's of course an incredibly good question. It's because some of the story I didn't tell you here. When I was doing the climate series, I was dealing with a lot of philanthropies that were engaged with, climate issues and other issues that were sort of central to our reporting. And the Times at that point was looking for other ways, it still is, to sort of organize some areas of its journalism around advertising and subscriber stuff, and one of those was around cities. I just thought, I don't want to kind of jury rig our coverage in an area to find subscribers, or what. There are people out there already with billions of dollars, frankly, who are committed to these issues, and there are other news organizations which do philanthropic, which have philanthropic support. I would just ask them. And so, in a way, I opened the subject up at the Times, and then I came to realize that it became an added level of difficulty, because they said, well, we're interested in this, but we need to think about it. It wasn't that they were opposed, and they weren't just looking for money exactly, but I became to realize that there were certain advantages, that it allowed us to exist as a somewhat independent organization within the Times. I was able to hire people, a really remarkable team of people, and as I said, to make an argument that we could do this according to somewhat different metrics. So whether we remain this way and continue to exist as a, look, the Times contributes a lot to Headway. So first of all, I'm on the Times, a couple of my other colleagues are on the Times, many parts of the Times are already contributing to Headway. So this is not something that the Times is not behind or putting in a lot of investing already in. But I think there is an interest in how the Times can do philanthropically related work that is not just in our financial interest. So we have, as part of the program, a fellow who we will train, and then we will pay to work at a local news organization. We have plans to do much outreach in schools. We're interested, as I said, in sort of seeding local journalism, which is a huge terrain far beyond Headway's ambition, but which we want to begin to try to explore. So, I tell you from our side, it provides us a certain flexibility, but also allows us to do things that the Times would not ordinarily do. From the other side, I think it provides supporters with, a journalistic platform for work that is consonant with their interests. But I can't speak for them. All I can tell you is there are no strings attached, and so for us functioning this way, it allows us complete independence. Yeah, sorry, Dan. Oh, you're pointing to somebody else?
No, I was trying to get the microphone.
Oh, okay.
I need to think that my question wouldn't be available to the world.
Worry, yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, I have the microphone, so I use it. I'm sorry. I was wondering, is really, we talked about this earlier already, is really the journalism different? Or is it the combination of journalism and engagement? I called it activism.
Yeah.
The difference, because I didn't see the real difference in the journalistic part.
Yeah. Look, as I said to you earlier, too, I think when I sat down to write the East River thing, which was not the thing I had intended to start with, I'd started on homelessness. It was just becoming very complicated, and I thought that was not the place to start. I had a lot of trouble. Like, what am I writing about here? What is this thing? So I have to admit up front, and I think this is okay. This is another reason why this can exist as a somewhat independent thing. We're feeling our way through this. But I'm most comfortable saying that we're not reinventing journalism. Dan and I were talking earlier, journalism is constantly reinventing itself. And the ambition is to do the kind of journalism that we are known for and we do well. But it's a difference between, a story around this. We do lots of these stories, and I've done them too. The ones you do, it's why I mentioned Jakarta as opposed to Rotterdam, right? The story that you want to do is, the population of over 50s who are homeless is booming, and you find a portion of these people, and you engage in a kind of poverty porn. So those stories are useful and important, but they're slightly different. They're asking a question up front differently than it's focusing. Terry is part of my story, but the story is really about a system, the question Josh asked. And that's really difficult to write about and to make engaging. I hope I succeed. And it's also just not exactly what we do. So we're feeling our way around this, but I do think that this combination of ambitions that are a little different, and mostly trying to, you used that word too before, longitudinal, trying to have a perspective that just isn't really what we're leaning into today. The Times has become increasingly a miracle that turns out, stories every second. Melissa's here. It's like, I'm sure she's contributing to them constantly. We do live journalism. Foreign reporting used to be, you'd go off somewhere and come back with a story 2 weeks later. Now I should probably write 6 stories a day. So that's great, but what does it mean to take a completely different time scale in mind? And then to stick with that for a long time. Josh goes off and does a story somewhere. How often does Josh go back? No, it's not a criticism. Go back and do that same story the year later and 6 months after that, et cetera. So, yeah, Dan.
Well, thank you for a great talk, and good luck and Godspeed with the project.
Thank you.
And by the way, your efforts to lower expectations over lunch were really beneath you. 2 questions.
Yes.
One of which I think we just saw a small part of. What has been the reaction of your colleagues at the Times and perhaps elsewhere? Because I can imagine there'd be a lot who would say, this is fabulous, and others who would say, well, you're not sticking it to the man, so how can this be journalism?
Yeah.
That's question number one. The other question is it fair to say that Headway is part of a larger movement in which journalism is becoming a way of finding a lot of insights from social science and amplifying them? So I think that across journalism, we're a long way from the front page and the ink-stained wretches who are just finding the latest outrage. That a lot of it is finding the work of really interesting people who are paid by universities mostly to do that longitudinal work, and that it is allowing a much greater public platform for evaluating it, broadcasting it, and the like.
Yeah. Okay, so there are a couple questions. The first about reaction. I mean, it's hard to answer questions like that because mostly people will say to my face, this is, what are you doing? I don't think. So I've been really shocked by the reaction, which has been very, very positive. And I think that's partly collegiality, but it's also, I think that there is some sense that there is a space out there to be filled, which is shared by a wider range of my colleagues than I had thought. But I don't know. I also think the reactions. I was talking to Terry, our public squatter, who was give a talk somewhere, and people were saying, "Well, this is just journalism." So I think that's just we'll just have to see. But what there has not been, I don't think, is the stories. I'm hoping that my story on East River and the hindsight pieces and the Congo, they stand up as what we do and are our standard. And so I hope they reach that threshold. As to the other question, there's no question about it that a lot of, my piece is grounded a lot in the work of social scientists around issues of expertise, participatory democracy, and all this kind of stuff. It's really built around that, and I think absolutely. You were talking about political economy earlier, and this whole field of studies around equity, and so yeah. What is interesting with Matt Thompson, who's a remarkable person, and and just a wonderful person to work with, is that Matt has really opened it up to other ideas about, as I said, futurists and thinking around how we can build conversations that engage a public. He brought this guy in who teaches at UCLA now, who worked for Arup, an engineering firm, but he's really a futurist and a designer, who sort of stages these different scenarios for people. He did this in Hawaii in a kind of remarkable way. And what you saw is that it's a kind of... It just allows people like the models that Vishan did for Penn Station, for people to begin to realize that futures can have many different... You can't predict them, but that it's not a black and white situation. So I'm just saying that, yes, we want to open this up to a different range of expertise, and we're definitely going to lean into that quite a bit. I want to say one thing I kind of forgot, by the way, in the process of this. And I want to say to people like Frank here, too, that, I learn a lot from architects and architecture, and the truth is that architects, by their very nature, are people who have to collaborate and listen to a lot of different people. It sort of is the job, unless you're just designing a project for a particular single client. Generally, you have all of these competing kinds of interests, and so this sort of openness is something that I think influenced a lot my thinking about how I do my job, but also how how we should do Headway. I think it's important for me when I'm talking about an architectural project or an urban project, as with Headway project, to make sure that I am sort of understanding, like any good reporter, a range of different views. And it's just a general point, but yeah.
Thank you. It was really fascinating for all sorts of reasons beyond journalism.
Okay, good.
I want to speak about time, not the New York Times, but
time.
And the last example, or the last moment too, that you spoke about architecture is very good for this, because it's a future-oriented activity. That is carried out
Correct.
with immense investment in the present, in the details, the very nitty-gritty details of the present.
Yep.
And I think all of your vignettes were like this.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine a different future.
Mm-hmm.
Look at what's going on right now, here and there, etc., etc.
Right.
We have nothing about the past. Except for the past of the future.
Right.
How people imagined the future 10 years ago.
Right.
Now, I thought about it because one of the great projects of the New York Times was recently a past project, 1619
Correct.
book. And I wonder how you think about this together.
Yeah.
It's really a reimagination of the past.
Correct. Yeah. Well, 16. I'm sorry, Avi. Yeah, go ahead.
And really, can these two directions exist separately?
Yeah. No, you ask a really, really super interesting question. 1619 was on my mind a lot, and we may try to do a project about futures that sort of is with the magazine, that we're going to be doing various magazine issues that sort of is builds on 1619. Well, one of the things that came up in a conversation with the magazine editors was, well, maybe we could think of alternative presents to go backwards and imagine different futures to now rather than different futures. It seems like a small difference, but I think it's kind of profound. There's a group of African American architects in America that formed that did a show at the Museum of Modern Art, and I got to know them, and we may do a project with them too. One of them has already done a project sort of reimagining what would have happened if a slave revolt in New Orleans in 1812, I think, had succeeded, and what the city would have been like. Another architect, Walter, did something similar in Oakland, sort of had this happened in 1970, then what would the city look like? I may not be answering your question directly, but yes, I agree with you. I think one needs to look in both directions, and that will help us understand how we got here, but also what the alternatives were, or potential alternatives were to the present. So yeah, yeah. I may not be answering your question directly, but 1619 was very much an inspiration to me because of its breadth and exactly what you said. It just opened up a question. If we were to think about the past differently, what would it be? So.
Thank you.
After that last one, Lawrence, you just decided.
No, I was taking that question. Just kidding.
Wonderful talk. I think everybody's agreed on that.
Thank you.
I was very struck by the East River project example, which you called a failure of deliberative democracy. And I think it's a single example of a larger challenge, which is our apparent inability to do big infrastructure projects at a time when we need them more than ever, for climate change reasons, for all sorts of reasons.
Right.
Also 50 years, 60 years of neglect. In the old days, we had Robert Moses. Those of you who aren't American may not have heard of him, but he changed the urban landscape of East Coast United States, some would say in a not so good way, slum removal, development of whole areas and unhousing huge swaths of population. In any case, we can't and don't want to do it that way anymore. But my question to you is, what kind of political process do you envisage as making, whether it's East River Park or other large projects, possible, and how do you see Headway contributing to that?
Yeah, so I mean, the story that I wrote was sort of, it talked a lot about Moses, and because Moses designed East River Park, and one of the paradoxes of what happened is that a group claiming to represent essentially the Jane Jacobs side of community activism was defending the preservation of Robert Moses's park so that it wouldn't be sort of undone and rebuilt. The story, that's why I'm definitely telling you we're not doing a good news section. The story raises issues and talks to a lot of social scientists and others about this question about what has happened and how did we get to this point that we doubt expertise, what has happened to the process of community engagement that it has been corrupted in such a way that it thwarts sort of big change. Personally, I mean, I'll answer this, and it's really an interesting thing. We don't have all night, I know, but I was just going to say, I go into this a little in the East River Park piece. In the 1970s, there was a plan to redo the west side of Manhattan called Westway. Most people have forgotten this, but it was a massive plan to redo the entire defunct waterfront of the west side because, New York was no longer a port. And it would have essentially created parkland all the way from Lower Manhattan up to 59th Street or higher. And it was defeated because at that time there was the first sort of wave of anti-Robert Moses, top-down big, even though Moses himself opposed Westway. But it symbolized a kind of approach. And it also dovetailed with the new environmental movement, which was just emerging out of Rachel Carson and others. And so the activists who opposed Westway, I'm getting to a point, stick with me, they brought a case that the development would would impair the mating habits of juvenile striped bass in the Hudson River, who used the defunct piers, the piles of the defunct piers, to mate. And a federal judge agreed. And so the entire plan was killed. Essentially, the federal government would have paid for it. We would have buried the West Side Highway under the river, so this would have all been pedestrianized. Sorry, Greenland. There would have been a lot of development and so forth. But I mention all of this because what emerged in the 60s, sort of the transformation of, into people power, and the emergence of movements like Jane Jacobs's sort of community engagement, but also other movements like the environmental movement, which had all sorts of good intentions and have had many good effects, increasingly have become instruments of obstruction. So for NIMBYs, not my backyarders, who are increasingly wealthy people trying to prevent development and thwart projects, their principal instrument is the environmental legislation that had been enacted in the early 70s, like the one that protected the mating patterns of striped bass. And the last thing I'll say about this is what's particularly, I don't know a better word than dangerous about this, is that because there is great fear of gentrification, because there is not enough housing and there's not enough development and not enough density and so forth in many areas, there's an alliance now that never existed in America between the NIMBYs, essentially wealthy people who want to prevent, often for racial reasons, want to prevent their neighborhoods from changing, and underserved communities who are threatened by any possibility of displacement. So you have this incredible sort of alliance of typically opposed groups, all intended to thwart anything Frank is ever going to build. And I'll just give you one example. We can stop because I'm sure I'm running just up against this. There are so many of these, but I mean, in the Mission District, I wrote about a project that there was San Francisco that would have added like 12 affordable apartments without a parking requirement. In other words, in order to sort of stop the idea that every household had to include parking spaces or garages, just promote cars, eliminate parking requirements, and 4 of the apartments would be affordable, subsidized in some form. The Mission, we're the most progressive place on the planet, basically spent about 10 years getting that project down below the affordable requirement and restoring the parking. So we're talking about 4 apartments. I wrote about a project at the South Street Seaport in Manhattan. It's been a surface parking lot since the early 1960s until like 2 months ago. The groups that were opposing this to preserve a surface parking lot in the middle of Manhattan in order to prevent the construction of a building which would have provided a lot of things, including about 70 or 100, I don't remember, subsidized apartments. I mean, how did we get to that point? And so I think, this is a conversation we need to begin to have honestly, and hopefully, we can help. Anyway, I think we've run up against this, so thank you guys. Thanks.